Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tinellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and enjoy. Listeners, if any of you out there haven't read Chris Hammer's novels yet, I'm hoping that this episode will change that situation. A former journalist and foreign correspondent, Chris is a highly acclaimed, award-winning, international best-selling author off the back of his thrilling trilogy of books, Scrublands, Silver and Trust, about journalist Martin Scarsden. This year, Chris has offered up a new standalone novel returning to the outback noir setting that made Scrublands so popular and compelling. Called Treasure and Dirt, this book is a sensational, suspense-filled, turbulent read that centres on a murder investigation in a fictional, desolate mining town on the New South Wales-Queensland border. With multiple storylines and themes, a cast of characters from the quirky to fanatical and downright dangerous, Treasure and Dirt plunges us into a complex world where nothing is as it seems and secrets cannot stay buried forever. I'm honoured to welcome Chris back to the podcast today. Hi, Chris.
Hi there, Claudine.
Thanks so much for joining me again. And wow, what a truly fantastic read. Congratulations.
Oh, well, thank you so much. That's very kind of you to say so.
Not at all. How are you feeling about its reception?
Look, pretty good. It's been out for about a week now and the feedback has been good. Mind you, people are nice, they are generous, but it seems to be getting a lot of support from booksellers, which is really important. So I'm incredibly grateful to all of them.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, in a number of important respects, this book was so different to Trust and Silver, but in other ways, it bore the same hallmarks that made Scrublands the success that it was. So was it a conscious decision on your part to return to Outback Noir, or was it more that this story simply took you there?
The funny thing is that even though people like myself are associated with so-called Outback Noir, this is actually the first one of my books that's actually set in the Outback. Scrublands was set in Western New South Wales, very dry, very drought-stricken, but still a farming community.
Yeah.
Silver was set on the coast and Trust is set in Sydney.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't an idea about the outback. The idea was more about a mining town, and the feeling was an isolated one. So one of those fly-in, fly-out mining camps. Which is not where the book is set, but that was the original idea.
Yeah.
And setting definitely plays a big role in my books. It helps inform the characters. It helps create atmosphere. So in some ways it was conscious. In other ways, I was a bit of the victim or the fortunate victim of circumstance, and that I had this idea for this incredibly remote mining camp out in the desert. And I was intending to drive across to South Australia and go to the Flinders Ranges, where I've never been, and looked spectacular. And then COVID hit and the borders shut. And I live in Canberra, and the only place I could really get to was New South Wales. So I was thinking somewhere there, and then just by chance, I saw a woman down at the local shops and she was wearing an opal pendant. I went, oh, an opal mining town, because then I could have the storyline with a big industrial mine and billionaires and all that sort of thing. But I could have individuals, sort of these hard scrabble, busted ass opal miners, sort of scrabbling, forever living in hope of finding, the big one, that sort of gold fever type feel. And then I had that. Unfortunately, I could drive up to Lightning Ridge, which is way up northwest New South Wales, but fortunately the New South Wales side of the Queensland border, which was shut when I was there. And so the town in Treasure and Dirt is called Finnegan's Gap. It's a smaller, wilder, fictionalised version of Lightning Ridge.
Okay, so despite it being a standalone, Treasure and Dirt is not completely unrelated to Martin Scarsden. In fact, he's mentioned a number of times, and the events of this book kind of pick up where Trust leaves off, doesn't it?
Look, it does. I mean, you're right in saying it's a standalone book. You don't have to have read the other three. In fact, you could probably say that of all of them. So we've got two new protagonists, though, and they're police officers. There's Detective Sergeant Ivan Lukic, who's a reasonably experienced homicide detective from Sydney, And he's thrown together with a very inexperienced detective, not a homicide detective, just a regular detective, Nell Buchanan, and she's been based out at Burke in the far west of New South Wales. And the reason I've switched away from Martin and Mandy is I kind of run out in some senses of things to say about them. They're not dispassionate, disinterested investigators in those first three books. They're really personal to them. There's a lot of their own history and they're confronting their own sort of ghosts, if you like. It's easy enough to come up with kind of crime plot lines, but that kind of personal plot lines I struggled with a bit. And then I thought, and also it becomes a little bit hard to believe. I know readers are very forgiving in this regard, but, to have them again embroiled in this terrible sort of personal, confronting sort of situations. So I thought I'd give them a break. And then I thought, well, Martin, of course, is a journalist, and it's informed somewhat by my career as a journalist. But I didn't think I could just have another journalist as a protagonist, because it would be like, well, Martin Scarsden light. So that's kind of why I ended up landing on the two police officers.
This book, in comparison to the others, was much more of a police procedural.
Yeah, a bit of a weird police procedural in that they go to this town. Look, let me just give the setup for the listeners. This isn't a spoiler because it happens in the prologue. There are these guys called ratters, and ratters, as I discovered on my trip to Lightning Ridge, are kind of the lowest of the low. These are people who, in the middle of the night, go down other miners' opal mines and plunder their opals, and then are gone before dawn. So we're with this crew of ratters. They're down an opal mine, and they discover a body, not just a body, someone who's been murdered and crucified, their body left to rot. So that's the setup. As I say, not a spoiler because that's in the first few pages. Then we're with these two detectives who are thrown together. They just meet there at Finnegan's Gap, Ivan coming in from Sydney and Nell from Burke, and they start investigating. And the more they investigate, the more secrets they uncover. What's perhaps a little unusual in the police procedural sort of space is, again, they're not dispassionate, disinterested investigators. Their own past comes back to confront them. Nell is actually, the reason she's been sent along at the last minute to help Ivan is because she's worked in Finnegan's Gap before when she was a young police officer in uniform. And she thinks she knows what happened when she was in the town before, but she's wrong. And meanwhile, Ivan has been confronted with an internal police investigation. Soon enough, their careers are on the line. They really need to get a result. It helps motivate them and impacts on some of their choices. So, yeah, it's a police procedural, but they've really got skin in the game.
Yeah, absolutely. So on that point, do you think that it made it more difficult to write than your previous novels? More research, perhaps?
Yeah, I was worried about that. Because in the world of journalism, I know it kind of back to front, if you like. And I did some research and I was thinking about it. And what I realised is that in writing a police procedural, you don't actually want to be completely accurate, because real life police work, there's a lot of drudgery, there's a lot of paperwork. It's a lot of procedure because things like the chains of evidence are very important, and making sure that things are done by the book so evidence is admissible in court. In real life police work, the case doesn't finish when you catch the perpetrator, which is what happens in crime fiction, right? You finish the book when you catch the perpetrator. But in real life, of course, that's halfway through the process. The second step is trying to get a conviction. Also, police often work in really big teams, which in a book, if you tried to write all the characters, you'd lose it all. And they're often working multiple cases at the same time. Time spans are often much longer, can take weeks and weeks and weeks, whereas in a book, you want to condense it. So what I began to realise that not just in my books, but pretty much all police procedurals, they're not actually that accurate. They're not really true to life. But the trick is to give the impression that it is, that sense of authenticity, of verisimilitude. So it's a little bit like you're creating a story of the imagination for the reader to enter. And I think you can actually over-research things. So I don't know about you, but I've read books and you'll read, there'll be a 3-page description of the crime scene or of an autopsy, and you think, well, the writer has sat in on the autopsy, has found it really interesting, and now they're telling the reader, but it doesn't advance the story, right? Yeah. It's one of those kill your darling type of things. I was concerned about whether I could sort of bring it off or whether it would work for me. But as it happens, it comes down to telling a good story, and that's going to trump details of police procedure.
You mentioned that you did travel to Lightning Ridge for this book, and I wanted to say that it gave readers a fascinating insight into opal mining or aspects of it. So, was there any particular research that you did in Lightning Ridge to bring that part of the story to the page?
Well, that whole concept I was telling about, the ratters down the mine, I wasn't aware of ratters. I walked into the miners' union or miners' federation office to seek some help. And I saw all these signs on the wall, like dob in a ratter and stuff. And I said, what's a ratter? And they told me, and a little light bulb went off. Oh, yeah, that's good. I'll use that. And they put me in contact with this great bloke called Fred, who was an opal miner, a very experienced opal miner. So he took me down his mine, explained how it worked. Part of it was just the information of how it worked, but also it was the impression of going down the mine. And also driving around, picking up on the landscape, almost not necessarily taking that many notes, but more like just soaking it up and seeing what I might be able to use. And as I said before, I think settings are important in my books. They're important in a lot of books. So it was a really useful trip, and I was so lucky because I could get there and get back. And I was intending to go back later in the year with a friend, or this year rather, and then it just, lockdowns hit us and it just wasn't possible. So I was really grateful that I could get up there while I could.
I can't remember if you actually, you talked about ratters and the fact that they're the lowest of the low in the opal mining community, but could you explain why that is and why it's a problem for opal miners?
Oh, because they're thieves. They go down and steal from their fellow miners. So everyone's there, they're working their own claims, and then there are these guys who basically cheat and rob their mates. So if you're caught ratting, up from breaking the law and all of that, who knows, you may well find yourself beaten up and run out of town, I imagine.
I expect so. Now, another eye-opening aspect of this book, which I found incredibly fascinating, was your exploration of this idea of rare earth mining. Well, it's not an idea, it's an actual thing. And I didn't know that before I read your book. And I have to confess that I had to go and find out what rare earth elements were and why they were important. But as always with your books, Chris, you've captured the zeitgeist with this topic. What drew you to this topic, and why was it important for you to explore it in this book?
Let's try and not give away too many spoilers. But rare earths are a group of metals that aren't actually that rare. They're just kind of hard to find. And they're very important for some high-tech applications such as military hardware and computers and whatever. They're often called a strategic group of metals because of that. And the problem for America in particular is that the Chinese dominate rare earth mining and manufacture, partly because the processing of it tends to be rather environmentally dirty. And so there is a push on from the Americans, to source alternative sources of supply of these metals. So it's a real thing, and Australia does have a couple of rare earth mines already, and it's probably looking at developing more. So that's a real world issue that keys into this current situation with a growing confrontation between, say, this new AUKUS alliance and nuclear submarines, the trepidation around the growing power of China.
I've always admired the complexity of your books, as I said before we started recording, and the different intersecting storylines that make trying to figure out who done it a difficult proposition. And Treasure and Dirt is certainly no different in that regard. So I wanted to ask you, Chris, do you plot out all these different threads in advance?
No. No, I try to. I really try to. So you've got those two twin poles of the plotters versus the pantsers, the ones who write by their seat of their pants. I'm very much a pantser who wishes that they were a plotter. So I try and plot stuff out. The thing is, then as I'm writing it, it starts evolving. Characters take on lives of their own, and I get a different idea. Like if I get a better idea, well, I'll scrap what came before. And the idea, I guess, between the multiple plot lines, this started back just when I was writing Scrublands, more or less as I kind of a hobby project. So I was writing a crime fiction novel, and I was thinking, well, plot's really important, which it is, although I've come to realise that there's all these other elements that are at least as important. But there's always this problem with crime novels, is that if the reader guesses who done it halfway through the book, it becomes very disappointing. And on the other end of the spectrum, if the author introduces a whole lot of new information, dumps it on the reader 10 pages from the end, and the murderer is some character that you've never heard of until then, similarly, the reader feels dissatisfied and cheated. So I thought, I know what I'll do. I'll have more than one crime. This is in Scrublands. And that way, if the reader guesses the outcome of one of those threads, they probably won't get all of them. And as time went on, I realised that was probably right, because because I didn't know who did half the crimes. It was only in writing the book that I kind of worked out what happened. And in this book, there's a sort of variation of that, in that there's one body, but there may be more than one crime.
So how do you keep track of all of those different plot threads and make sure they're all resolved by the end of the book?
Like most crime writers, there'll be a whole lot of stuff that I'm writing down that's not there in the narrative of the book. So you'll see people writing and they'll have Post-it notes everywhere, right? But because I was a journalist for so long and working on computers, I have that, but it's all on the screen. So there'll be timelines. Most crime writers are going to have some sort of timeline, because you need to keep track of where everybody is. So, for example, that the murderer could be seen here and then seen somewhere else 2 hours later. Have they had enough time to go and kill someone, dispose of the body, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm quite spatial. So all the books have maps in the front, and this one is no different. It's got a fantastic map of this fictional place. And what I found when I was writing Scrublands, which, as I say, I was doing in my spare time over a fairly extended period of time, I was writing about a fictional town, so I couldn't just go and look at a map. So I started drawing a map myself, just to make sure buildings were still in the same place and distances were the same. And then we ended up putting it in the book, but drawn by a proper artist, of course, not my sort of feeble sort of sketches. And I stuck with that. Even Trust, which is set in Sydney, it's the one book that's set in a real location with some imagined buildings, and it's a kind of imagined Sydney. So that has a map in it. But this one, the maps start as a reference to myself. So yeah, I have timelines, I'll have a map for a reference. Often with the characters, I'll write a bit of a backstory, try and work out, which doesn't appear in the narrative, but it's helping me understand them and their motivations. So when they do appear on the page, they're going to seem more fleshed out, have their own backstories, their own compulsions, etc.
In this book, there's the main dramatic question, who killed Jonas McGee, the opal miner, but there's also questions, as you mentioned earlier, surrounding both Ivan and Nell and why they were sent to investigate the case, and both have question marks over their professional integrity from within the police service, as you said. And I think one of the themes that you explore so deftly in this book, Chris, is the idea of police integrity and not selling out to journalists. There's an unflattering commentary on the role of journos in relation to the integrity of police investigations. I mean, I wondered if that was something you've come across in your own work, and do you think that investigative journalism is a threat to policing?
No, just the opposite. Investigative journalism is really essential. People say, oh, well, these journalists, they're never going to discover anything. But just look at all the royal commissions that Four Corners has inspired, if I can put it that way. And indeed, you'll find in any organisation that the one way of getting stuff out. So I was just watching Four Corners last night and reading The Guardian this morning, the Pandora Papers, all this sort of money laundering, the use of offshore tax havens. Someone has leaked all that information out about this nefarious activity by the rich and powerful. That person hasn't leaked to law enforcement agencies. They've leaked to the media. And I think that's a very deliberate and very wise decision, because when the media makes a real song and dance of it, that will then give politicians the backbone to instruct the police to investigate and all those. And so, no, but I think on the ground every day, the police will probably have a quite ambivalent feelings about the media. Sometimes they can be really helpful. More often they just get in the road. You know, they start speculating. There's always the danger of they'll say something they shouldn't and thereby disrupt court proceedings, you know, in the worst situation, cause a trial to be aborted. So I think most police will probably have a fairly ambivalent view of the media, and on a day-to-day basis, they just see them as a bit of a pest.
So like Scrublands, in Treasure and Dirt, setting is as much a character in the book as the human characters, as you mentioned earlier. There's the dust, the heat and the flies, and it paints a really quite a desolate picture of a town that once thrived with opal lust. Do you think that this is only something you can capture by being there, by seeing, by experiencing?
It helps, but I think all writers are different, and some writers definitely need to be able to see and breathe and experience. And others are just fantastic at imagination. So the one that I would cite there would be Tolkien and Lord of the Rings, right? The guy never went to Middle Earth, obviously, but he makes it seem so real and so authentic, all this sort of hokum about, you know, magic and rings and all of this sort of stuff. Yeah. But the power of the imagination is such, and it's so kind of consistent throughout, that it becomes, you know, a really immersive place to go as a reader. So I think for us sort of lesser writers, there's still the possibility of doing that. What I found with Trust, actually, which is the one book of mine that is set in a very real place, it's set in Sydney, partly because if I invented a fictionalised city of 3 or 4 million on the east coast of Australia, that would simply seem fanciful and kind of what's the point? And I thought, right, well, how do I write Sydney? And then I realised that whenever you write about a real place, it's an imagined version anyway. So if you think about all the books that you've read, say, set in New York, they're not describing the same New York, right? Bonfire of the Vanities, you know, Breakfast at Tiffany's, Fleischmann's in Trouble, you know, the list, Sex and the City, you know, whatever. It's all recognisably New York, but they're all completely different. And so I think that's true. You know, I went to Lightning Ridge, but Finnegan's Gap is not Lightning Ridge. I can exaggerate things, I can ignore other things, I can change the geography around to suit the plot. So say in my book Silver, it's set on the coast, but there's an area that's outside mobile phone range, which really helps the plot. So, but if I went to a real town, that you know, in this day and age probably is no longer the case. So that was a useful thing too. And the other big advantage, and this is the former journalist in me talking about having a fictionalised thing, you're not in danger of defaming people. If I write about a small town that's a real town, and I write that the local police sergeant is corrupt, or the mayor's corrupt, or the council's corrupt, or, you know, the local, you know, builders are dumping pollution in the creek or something, that could actually impact on real life people. I mean, at worst, I could end up getting sued, but even without that, people often will read something and say, oh, this is a thinly veiled disguise of real people. So that's the other advantage of having a fictionalised place. You don't have to worry too much about any of those things.
Chris, another thing that I truly admire about your books is the timeline. Like Scrublands, I believe the events of this book played out over the course of a week or slightly less. I'm guessing this is a deliberate device that you use to ramp up the tension. Do you find that constraining in any way, or does it help you keep your story on track whilst writing it?
Probably all of the above. I'm sure I'll write a book in the future where the timeline will be spread over a much greater period of time because the story demands it. In instances you've given, I think it helps create more tension, but possibly helps the reader sort of visualise, if that's the right word, you know, or get a grasp on the chain of events that's unfolding sort of before them. How important it is, I'm not sure. It's just maybe a little thing that adds adds to the whole.
I felt by the end of this story that Ivan and Nell had more to do. Does that mean that we're going to see more of them in future?
Yeah, look, I think so. It's
Yay.
just, that wasn't the intention as I started writing it. Mind you, it wasn't the intention with Martin and Mandy when I started writing Scrublands either. So there is more to tell. And it gets back to what I was saying about Scrublands, Silver and Trust. Is an important part of the book is the kind of emotional journey that those characters are on throughout those books. And that's why I felt it hard to come up with another Martin and Mandy story, because I'd said so much about them. It's not to say I won't revisit them at some stage, but it'll have to be the right sort of story. Here, it's the same thing. Ivan and Nell they've kind of got skin in the game. There's an emotional story for both of them, and it's not finished. So I think, yeah, definitely there'll be at least 2 more books, I would think. Yeah.
Fantastic. Now, the last time that we chatted, I think it might have been around this time last year, we talked about the TV production of Scrublands. How's that going along, or is it going along, or like everything else, has it been derailed by COVID?
I suspect you could possibly just run the answer from last year. Look, I'm told it's making progress. It's being developed. There's writers on board. Until they start filming, there's nothing for sure. So a lot of things get optioned, and they just kind of sit there for a while and then fade away. Then some get kind of, the work gets put and they get developed. But they're being developed by production companies, and the final say of whether they get made or not is going to depend on the people who are buying them, which is like the TV networks or streaming services or whatever. Until they sign off on it, it doesn't go ahead. So it's pretty much the same situation as last year. Then again, if it goes ahead, it could all happen quite quickly. From day to day, I've got no ideas what's going on with that, which is probably a good thing.
You just got to get along and do what you do best.
Yeah, exactly.
Chris, if there was one thing that you would like readers to take away from this book, what would it be?
You know what? I think that's really up to them. It's been interesting, in these last few years, having written this book and getting out and talking to readers. I've really realised that I'm only sort of half the process. I was under the impression I wrote a book. It's there, it's set in stone. And then you talk to people and you find that they take away the most extraordinary things. And for some people, it's the plot. And for other people, it's the characters. And other people, it's the setting. And other people, it's the writing, whatever. So I'd just be happy if people like it, because everyone's different. There are so many books and so many good books. It's always quite the compliment when someone chooses to read one of mine.
You've been kind enough to offer some tips for aspiring writers on this podcast, but I wondered if after 4 novels, you'd learned something about yourself as a writer that you didn't know before Scrublands was published.
Oh, a lot, yeah, without a doubt. I'm always, I try and write fairly instinctively from the heart, if you like. But then the second part of the process is editing, which you try and do objectively, with a head, if you like. And as I look at my own work and how I go about it, I'm trying to evolve a bit. I'm trying new processes. So some writers find a process that works for them and they stick with it. And that's very sensible, I guess. I'm trying to, try different things on, a bit more plotting, a bit less pantsing, different voices, different structures. I think, though, maybe the big thing I've found is you can think about all those sorts of things and you can get distracted by, say, the publicity that goes around a book coming out and going to a writers' festival or whatever. But at the end of the day, it's all about the writing and it's all about the book. Everything else is kind of a bit extraneous. And I think some writers can get distracted easily. But, at the end of the day, nothing else really counts in that world except for what's happening with the book.
Chris, I've been watching your star rise now for a few years, and it seems that you're just getting better and better. I wanted to say congratulations on this fabulous novel, and I wish you every success with it. Here's to a brighter 2022, and hoping we finally get to see you at the Northern Beaches Readers Festival. Thank you for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Oh, thank you so much, Claudine. It would be so good to get up there to that festival. You guys have worked so hard trying to get it off the ground, and he's hoping third time lucky, right?
Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage claudinetинellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.